Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Herald and Nelson Mandela University Community Dialogue, the digital series. We're quite excited and honored that you could join us this afternoon. Our conversation looking at Black Lives Matter, how can we subvert the systemic racism still prevalent in our racialized society? Our panelists, Crane Sudin, Busisiwe Ngosi, and Eusebius McKaiser, are going to take us through some of the contestations and debates surrounding Black Lives Matter. Of course, you can interact with us from wherever you are live streaming from, be it YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, or on the Arena webinar, and we'll bring your comments and questions into the engagement. So over the past few months or so, we have seen the world being confronted once again with the injustices as it pertains to Black bodies, particularly experienced by police brutality. The Black Lives Matter, of course, movement is a movement that was established in 2013 after the killing of Trayvon Martin at the hands of police. And of course, quite recently, it has sparked again debate in terms of how we respond to brutal killings of Black lives all over the world. And of course, South Africa has not been immune to that conversation and to the need to address those issues. We've entered lockdown in March, and into lockdown, about 12 people were killed at the hands of the state. So quite an interesting conversation we'll be having, and our panelists will take us through that. But before we get to that, I'd like to welcome to the platform Rochelle de Kock, the editor of the Herald. Rochelle?
Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you to our panelists for being with us and having this very important discussion around a very important global movement. Black Lives Matter, so important, topical, the kind of thing that really gets people heated. And I think we're going to reflect those discussions here today. On behalf of the Herald and Nelson Mandela University, we'd like to welcome everybody. We have a long-standing partnership, but we usually have these kind of debates in venues. Lockdown has forced us to do things differently, and we're quite excited because this is our second virtual community dialogue. Have fun today. Let's keep it classy, but important. It's discussions that are important towards fostering change, and that's what we're really passionate about. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rochelle, for that. All right, so let me just do brief introductions on our panelists before we start the conversation. First up, we have Crane Sudin, who is the Chief Executive Officer at the Human Science Research Council. He is formerly the Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Cape Town. And of course, he has published work and articles, reviews, book chapters in areas of social cohesion, culture, education policy, comparative education, public history, and popular culture. Then we have Busisiwe Ngosi, who is the anti-racism manager at the Ahmed Cathedra Foundation. She's also the coordinator of the Anti-Racism Network of South Africa. She is the previous youth programs manager at the Ahmed Cathedra Foundation. And then lastly, on our panel, we have Eusebius McKaiser, who is a broadcaster, political analyst, lecturer, and author. He has, of course, over many years presented and produced several current affairs shows on SABC, on ENCA, on 702. He is the author of 3 best-selling books, A Bantu in My Bathroom, Could I Vote DA, and Run Racist Run. Right, so quite excited to have our panelists share some of their perspectives with us today. I'm going to give the platform to Crane Sudin first. Just give us some reflections on what does Black Lives Matter mean to you, and what are some of the conversations that emerge at this present time. Crane?
Thank you. Sorry for that. Thank you very much, Sipakazi. Am I audible, Sipakazi? Can you hear me nicely? Great. So I think it's really important for all of us to understand what is happening here now in this moment around Black Lives Matter. Because it's something that one can easily misunderstand. What is going on here is, in some ways, a reaction to a 500-year process through which the world has gone. For 500 years, the world has been subjected to incredible racism. We talk about this civilization through which we have gone, but this civilization has been accompanied by, and let's call it by its name, barbarism. We have had 500 years from the time that Black people, African people were forcibly taken across the Atlantic Ocean to the plantations in the United States. We have had the incredible dehumanization of people of color all over the world, but Black people in particular. And this dehumanization has been accompanied by this thing of race. Race, not racism. We have to distinguish those terms, Sipokazi, and there's an important discussion to be had there about distinguishing them. What race is this thing where people are described and categorized and classified in particular kinds of ways. When these people were brought across the Atlantic, they were described in bodily terms in ways in which didn't used to be the case anywhere in history before that. At this particular point, Black bodies became abject bodies. They became inferior bodies. They became sexualized bodies. They became bodies that you could beat, bodies that you could humiliate, and attached to these bodies in the minds of these people who came up with a system of racism was the fact that these people were close to animals. They were like, in this evolutionary process, they were this link between animals and, if you like, proper humans, whites. So we're looking at 500 years of the pain of all of this, Sipokazi. And this is what this moment is all about. It's about trying to show how we've had to live with this pain, and it's an appeal to the world to acknowledge this pain in the same kind of way as the Holocaust is acknowledged. The Holocaust is acknowledged as this civilizational, if you like, blight. But racism is an even bigger blight, as is sexism, by the way. And so what we're dealing with here is this phenomenon now of Black pain. And we're having to respond to it and to try and find ways of accounting for it and how we get beyond it. And I hope that the discussion, gets to this point later on where we can talk about how each of us as individuals and as members of solidarities, communities, and so on, come to respond to it. But the big thing that I want to leave with us all here, colleagues, is the enormity of this pain. And how this pain has incapacitated us. Thank you very much.
All right. I think I'm going to not engage as of yet. I'm going to allow Busisiwe Ngosi just to give her reflections before we get to any engagement. Busisiwe?
Good afternoon. Hope you can hear me now.
Yeah.
I think to start off, I have to say that the moment I was told that Prof and Eusebius are going to be part of this panel, I woke up in a bucket of sweat and I was so close to running away. But I think that's just because you have two gentlemen that are versed and that have so much knowledge that they scared me. But anyway, nevertheless, I'm here now and I will speak to my own experiences, my own thoughts, which I also feel is quite important. I think also history has played a role in how you as a Black woman would view yourself to be less than the men. So the moment I saw these two gentlemen, the fear then crept in. So I think we can also look at that as one of the factors. But when it comes to Black Lives Matter, I also agree with Prof. Sudine that this is a pain, and it's not just a new wound, it's an old wound that people have been carrying around. And I think just these killings during a pandemic just burst people's anger. So people came out in their numbers, people wanted to talk about it, but also people wanted action. I don't think any other time before we've had so many people around the globe talking about race, talking about law enforcement brutality, talking about the systematic racism that exists currently, you know? And I think this is a good thing, because even in South Africa, you then found schools or school learners, previous former Model C schools, your private schools, etc., who then came to the fore to say, you know what, we experience this racism on a day-to-day basis and we want the change. So for me, as sad as the killings have been, I think that it happened just at the right time, where each and every one of us now needs to self-reflect, but also we all have a role to play in dismantling the systematic racism that currently exists on a global level. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for those reflections, Busisiwe. Eusebius?
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to start off by thanking the Herald and Nelson Mandela University for this beautiful conversation. I'm already learning a lot just listening to Busisiwe and to Crane, and we're not even 10 minutes into the dialogue, so I think it's absolutely beautiful. I also want to affirm you, Busi. I think one of the consequences of white supremacy, and in tandem with white supremacy, patriarchy, is of course that we have a lifelong project of having to deal with imposter syndrome as Black people and as women, as queer people. We don't feel like we belong. We don't feel like we are the repositories of knowledge, and that men, including Black men, somehow, and older people, because there's also an age dynamic to this intersectional conversation, are the ones who have a monopoly on thought and knowledge. I commend you for your vulnerability in your opening remarks, and I also want to push back on it because there is a particular phenomenological set of experiences that you have had as someone who's younger than me and Crane, who's a woman, who's differently bodied, and the way you experience your race embodiment is profoundly different to me. And so I've learned a lot just from listening to you in the first couple of minutes. I want to make 2 points in my own opening remarks, and then we can have our dynamic conversation. The first is one that underscores and agrees with what Crane had said about the pain that this moment signifies. Everyone who's listening to and watching this webinar, I would be bold enough to call on you in a moment of private reflection to either journal or in your head go through an exercise that starts with the following words. Racism has harmed me in the following ways. And then to think what follows from that, and to reflect on the ways in which, at a very personal level, each one of us have been injured by racism and by the history of racism and anti-Black racism and white supremacy, which are twin global histories. I have been harmed by that as an individual. And of course, we know that systems and institutions have been profoundly harmed. And the reason why that's the first of the 2 points I want to make is that it is reasonably easy, as Busisiwe had said, to become, if you spend enough time in the academy, especially versed in the theory around race literature and post-colonial discourses, to make the right intellectual and theoretical moves. But as we said earlier this week, there's an affective component. In other words, a psychological and emotional component to this conversation, but I don't think we see enough in the public space, but whereby we allow ourselves and give ourselves psychic permission to talk about how racism has harmed us. If you are a white ally in the fight against racism watching this webinar, you need to reflect on, at a deeply subjective level, how have you been harmed by the history of white supremacy? If you are a black professor, former deputy VC of UCT, what has been the consequences of being embodied as a black person in an institutionally white space where your existence was queer, where epistemologically you've had to do harder work than other academics who are phenotypically white to be taken seriously in the academy as a thought leader, as a producer of knowledge. And that has led to many forms of harm. In myself, for example, a lot of people think of me as super confident because of my training in debate and public speaking and being on radio. But I still carry with me the deep inferiority complexes that come with being black. If I get offered a job, for example, and the next question is, how much do you want, Eusebius? Then I look down on the floor. I don't have the confidence of a mediocre white person to say I'm worth 3 million rand. I'm worth 5 million rand. So even with my CV, with my linguistic dexterity, with my knowledge around race and racism, you will find many everyday examples in my life, Busisiwe, where I too display the kind of lack of confidence that you were, I think, so bravely sharing with us in your opening remarks. And that is a consequence of white supremacy and of anti-black racism. So that's the first set of thoughts I want to make. The last, if I may, and rein me in, Sipokazi, if I go over time. And I'll just
I think you are over time. Can we park that for later and you'll just unpack on that once we engage? Or is it pertinent that you can you do it briefly?
Yeah, let me do it in 30 seconds because I want to put something on the table for us to wrestle with so that we don't only agree, because I agree with everything Crane has said. The point I was going to make, and I'll unpack it in the conversation, Sipokazi, is we've got to be clear what it is that we are fighting for. Where I disagree with many scholars, many older South African activists in particular, in the academy and outside, is that we are not and should not be fighting for a non-racial South Africa. We should be fighting for an anti-racist South Africa. And I want us at some point to have a debate about what the difference is and why non-racialism is the wrong terminology to aim at.
Right. Thanks for those remarks, colleagues. We are already getting comments and some engagement, so please do keep on engaging with us and leaving your questions and comments, and we'll bring that into the conversation. I just want to go back to you, Busisiwe. You were talking about, and it's similar to a question that's being brought on here by MJ, asking us to just talk a little bit about the racism that is happening in schools. And I particularly want to ask about the app that you have been working on as part of the anti-racism app, where people can actually report acts of racism. Pertaining to those cases, is one able to report cases that are similar to what is happening now in high schools where the racism is not explicit? So is institutional forms of racism also something that can be reported via this app?
Okay, the racism reporting app is something that is not completely done, I would say, because on a daily basis, we are picking up new things that we are adding onto it. But it gives you some definitions around what systematic racism is, what non-racialism is, Eusebius, and what it means to be an anti-racist. But it also looks at conscious and unconscious biasness. So before you report an incident, it tries and give you some meanings of the things that you might be reporting on. And luckily enough, we've had students who've used the app as a mechanism of reporting the incidents of racism. And then from there, we then are able to engage with schools But at the same time, it's being used by adults, and we haven't really advertised it, which has been funny. But you have so many cases that come through on a daily basis, and I think this past 2 months during lockdown has been the worst. And you've had the app crashing as well, because it's just not used to so much volume. And I think as a person who deals with these things, it's also emotionally challenging for me, because from minor cases to hectic cases that you get on a daily basis, and you want to be responding in the correct manner, and you want people to be getting the justice. And luckily for us, we've been able to come to terms with some partnerships. So the South African Human Rights Commission has been quite handy, but also Mediate Works, who have been giving some people legal assistance at no price. But I think what is important is just growing this app, growing the capacity to support people. So example, Lifeline also came to the fore, and they give counseling to people who have been affected by racism, because most of the time we look at racism cases to take to the Equality Court, take to the Human Rights Commission, but we don't look at the scars, we don't look at the bruises, we don't look at people's mental health and how they've been affected by each and every incident. So it's trying to use this tool, this app as a tool in fighting racism, but also equipping people mentally and emotionally.
Yeah, just a quick one there, Busisiwe. To what extent does the app or the platform that the app, the platform of the app itself address racists? So no, you're talking about how there is counseling that happens for people that have been affected. What is the action that happens for racists? Do they get rehabilitated? Is there something like that? Yeah.
So unfortunately, the focus has been on getting justice for victims and less about the perpetrators when it comes to the app for now. Okay. And I'm hoping, though, that at some point we'll look at ways in which we also rehabilitate those racists and not just send them to court and send them to jail, etc.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Busisiwe. Let me bring in Crane there. And interestingly, that point you're talking about quite at the end, that pain and that centralization that is necessary for, your victims. And Crane was talking about pain in his earlier submission. And I want to draw that to the idea of like monuments and statues being removed. A lot of people activists actioning for the removal of statues as a rejection, right, of that particular narrative and history, but also as some remedy, I suppose, to address the pain that those colonial histories represent. What would you say to that effect, Crane?
So I'd say it's straightforward in some places and not so straightforward in other places. So straightforward, and it's like names, terms. We must remove from our repertoire of terms, words, symbols, those things that are deeply, deeply offensive, right? We must remove them. So the words that we use matter. The pictures that we use, the images that we use, all of those things matter for us. But we mustn't remove things in a way in which a lesson is not learned. So every single intervention that we make, and it can be of a multiple number of kinds, every single intervention that we make, we must be absolutely confident that the next point or stage to which we come, that we actually know more, that we are in a better position. So there are lots of things that you can do with these statues. The thing about simply getting them out of your sight is a half measure often in my view. It's like changing the name of something. You change the name and you leave the substance absolutely as it was before. It's a half measure. So we have to be very aware of how these things come to work in our lives, and ask how every single time we can be thinking, if you like, pedagogically, how do we make every moment a learning moment in our lives? You know, a moment in which we step away and say, actually, I understand better, or I see more. I have a bigger grasp of what is going on. So I am not going to say that the instinctive thing for us to do so each time is to pull it down. The pedagogical response is what I think every single time try and pursue. And so when you take that road statue down, what are you going to do after that? You know, what's the move which allows you to be able to come to understand the absolute horror embodied in what that whole thing was all about? And that's absolutely crucial for me.
Yeah. And just to follow up there, Eusebius was talking about the need for us to make that, you know, that clear distinction between race and racism. Oh, no, that was you, sorry. And by extension, I think Eusebius mentions this idea of us needing to grapple with this idea of non-racialism versus anti-racism, right? Some of your scholarship, of course, speaks to that idea of thinking about non-racialism. Can you just give a comment on that?
So there's a lot to say here. So, and one of the key ideas here is this belief in race. I mean, that's the key thing. This is what began 500 years ago. Race is not something which existed before 500 years ago. Race was introduced into, if you like, our cultural history. The word was used, but it wasn't used in the way in which it comes to be used from, you know, those plantation times in the United States. And the point about all of that is that we have now a constructed idea of who we are as human beings, right? A constructed idea. The way in which that idea has come to all of us, and this is the difference that is, I think, often not fully internalized and thought through. The way we've come to understand that idea of race as if it is real. It is not real. It is something that has been brought to us. And our critical task in life is to understand that as human beings. That this thing that these people created in our minds has been such a naturalized part of who we are. So I'm a non-racist. I don't believe in this thing that they tell me who I am. I'm a non-racist. Now, that word, and like just to pursue this with Eusebius, that word, non-racialism, has come to be meaning many things. And in South Africa, it means many things. It means multiracialism, it means colorblindness, and it means all of those kinds of things. But from about the 1940s, and you know, one can easily become like a teacher, and I don't want to sound like a teacher. Right, Busi, and I'm watching you. You know, I'm not your teacher here now, Busi, but I'm just saying that in the 1940s, South Africa comes to an incredible realization, and this is the stuff I've been writing about in the last 5 years. Incredible realization that the world had foisted on it this idea that human beings were naturally raced. And this is where the non-racialism, the new meaning of non-racialism comes out of Cape Town in the 1940s. And it's an anti-racist posture. It's anti-racist in its deepest kind of sense. And this is where, you know, the difference is in the way in which sometimes people use the idea anti-racism today. So people who use the word anti-racism sometimes today themselves believe in the idea of race. They believe in it, right? They just want this thing to be of race to be taken away, but they continue with this idea that they are in their genes. They have this thing which doesn't exist, you know. So that's the critical theoretical, in a sense, debate that we must be having in the country.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for that, Crane. And sorry to cut you. I'm just hoping as well that we could get some more engagement as we move along. Let me bring in Eusebius here. Crane was making mention of this idea of when we remove statues and monuments, it seems as if it's some half measure. And I think a lot of people oftentimes don't consider the removal of these monuments as an act of history in and of itself, right? That history is also removing it. When we think about that, and we think about people feeling offended by the removing of monuments and statues and Black Lives Matter, why would one reject an All Lives Matter narrative?
Okay, so Crane has said a lot. Let me say firstly, you shouldn't worry too much, Crane, about sounding didactic. You've got a beautiful mind and extremely articulate. I could listen to you for 3 hours as your student. So don't be self-conscious about your excellence. I'm going to race through a couple of points just in the interest of time. There is, in some of these debates in the academy, which I think we should make accessible to the public without apologizing for being academics, there are genuine deep disagreements, and then there are disagreements that turn out to be boring verbal disagreements upon reflection, and I think Crane has pointed to those. And I want to respond to the 2 issues that he has addressed via your question, Sipokazi. The first on statues and iconography generally. I saw an article that was written the other day in the Daily Maverick, in which the author had taken on the idea that focusing on toppling the statues really doesn't deal with the substance and in Crane's language. And I was a little bit annoyed by it because the article from someone that I love and deeply admire is naughty in misdescribing what young activists are doing. I do not know one single person who thinks that the Rhodes statue on the High Street in Oxford must be toppled, who thinks that it's a silver bullet for transforming Oxford University. No one is that stupid. Every activist who has had a strong view about toppling a statue are deeply aware of a truism, and that truism is the following: that toppling a statue is necessary but not sufficient for radical change. No one thought that UCT is going to be a fundamentally different place in terms of curricular content, the hidden curriculum, staff demographics, a sense of who belongs, and all the other issues on the substantive agenda just because the statue is gone. So the first point to be made is do not misdescribe your interlocutors. Describe them accurately, describe them generously, and listen to them. Young people are not idiots. They know that a statue does not give you the entire program of action for radical change. You need the other things. That said, iconography does matter, as Crane started off his comments with. And it matters because a statue signals who it is that you are affirming. Statues are not morally neutral. Statues tell you a certain degree of public adulation is attached to the name of the person who is publicly being memorialized. And for that reason, you cannot be indifferent to a statue. But at the same time, you can remove the statue, place it in a memorial, and you can still have the kind of pedagogy that Crane talks about without the public adulation. The average South African would fail a general knowledge test about Cecil John Rhodes, despite the fact that Rhodes is the most memorialized figure in history in Southern Africa. The point of that factoid, Sipokazi, is that the other side of this debate is also premised on a massive lie. And that lie is the assumption that the statues currently give us public history. And it actually doesn't, because there's low levels of public knowledge about these historical figures, even though the statues are there. And yet the assumption is if you topple it, people's knowledge will fall. But that's based on a lie. There isn't knowledge at present. And then the last thing I want to say, because again, I've left myself a little time for a big topic, is I would agree that on some articulations of non-racialism, there's no difference in opinion and theoretical commitments between myself and Crane. I do think that some South Africans mean by non-racialism colorblindness, typically your white liberals of a certain bent. And then there are others who are non-racist, like Crane, who have deep anti-racism politics that is an overlapping consensus between me and him. And that is why it's so important when you have race discourse that you define terms at the beginning of a dialogue so that you don't argue past each other. You might find that once you've written down on pieces of paper each of your definitions, that you use different labels for the same concepts. With me and Crane, I suspect some of that is what is going on here. But I also know that there are many people watching this webinar, Sipokazi, who refer to themselves as non-racialists, who don't share my politics, who are race eliminativists, who think that the fact that race is biologically queer means that racialized identities have not been politically significant in South African history. And that's absolute balderdash. And here I do want to challenge Crane, and then I'll end here. The fact that race doesn't exist, Crane, in biology is no longer a gotcha moment in race discourse, because a social construction can be powerful politically, experientially, and economically, even if it is a linguistic invention. And so a lot of people want to short-circuit complicated debates about the history of racism in South Africa by pointing to the truism that race doesn't exist biologically. It is actually not interesting that race doesn't exist biologically. And if I can end with an analogy, it is cold comfort to a family to say witches don't exist in nature if the social belief about witches is the basis on which someone gets burned in a particular village in South Africa. We have got to take the social constructivist view of race seriously and not over-interpret the consequences of the biological point.
All right, thank you there, Eusebius. I want to bring Busisiwe in, and I think I want to ask you, as it relates to particularly the space that you hold, as someone who was working with the youth when you were youth programs manager. I think that young people obviously might have quite a different layer in how they understand race issues as it relayed by Crane, and maybe to some extent Eusebius as well. And I'm going to link that to a question that's coming here on from Chanel. I think they're asking that we need to be able to engage phenomenological experience. And that is to say, for those who might not be familiar with that concept, experiences that we experience as bodies that are a particular way. You know, a lot of young people engage in multicultural, multilingual spaces. In your experience, what has their responses been to issues of race, to issues of racism? And does it to some extent speak to anti-racism and non-racialism?
Okay, I think I'll first start off by just touching on my own views around the statues. I think for me, as a young person, well, I'm 30, so I'm still young. As a young person, I see no need for having these statues. Of the view that these statues should be hauled off somewhere, locked up somewhere, and if you want to remind us of its history, we will take a history tour and go and see them. But you don't want to be looking at something that just evokes hurt. But also, who are they, you know? What relevance do they have to my life in a democratic South Africa today? I don't want to see them. I don't care about them. So for me, it's like, I read somewhere where someone said, if you divorce your wife, would you still want to be looking at your wife on a daily basis? and that's the same thing with these statues. Well, that's for me. But also when it comes to young people and race and racism, I think, number one, young people are more woke than ever before, in terms of they understand what racism is, they understand what it means to be an anti-racist, but they also understand what being biased is. And I think for young people now, they've been able to find their voice. So from your Zuleika Patels to the current cohort now that are voicing out their opinions, that are asking for changes. Young people want change, but young people also have solutions to the racism that they experience on a daily basis. So when it comes to definitions, we're not far off with young people. So young people are at adult level, but also young people's experiences today are not so different to the experiences that were experienced in a post-apartheid, during apartheid, I mean. So I think as adults or as the older generation, I think there's a lot that can be taken from young people, that can be learned from young people, but that can help also in fighting racism, the youth way.
Right, right. I think I'm going to bring in Crane there. And Crane Busisi was saying young people have a language for this, right? And it's linking to a question that's coming from Usporazi, not me. And Sporazi is asking, what should the conversation with our kids look and sound like in preparing them for the world when they are growing up? So as it pertains to race, what are the conversations we should be having with our children?
That's a powerful, powerful question, Sipakazi. I mean, it's what, so, you know, one of the wonderful things about learning is that you learn every single, I'm going to swear almost, every day, you know. You are learning all the time. And a very simple thing is that we learn actually that we don't know how to bring up our children, you know. We don't get taught that consciously by the society in which we find ourselves. We learn through kind of example, you know, and many people learn very nicely like that, but, you know, some people struggle. So here's the thing I would say to parents bringing their children up. I mean, teach you, and I'm sounding like an old person now. I mean, teach your children, you know, teach your children that they all have a history. All of us have histories. They all have, if you like, long traditions of knowledge embedded in their parents, their grandparents, and their great-great-grandparents. You know? These cultural things are very deep, deep, deep in all of our experiences as human beings. And we have to be treasuring those things. So teach your child to treasure his or her, their past. You know, treasure that. But here's the trick, Sipokazi. It's not a racial thing. You know, your past doesn't need to be erased in the way in which this dominant history is telling us. And here's an argument that I would have, you know, with Eusebius, because, you know, bodies have been raised. I'm putting the verb into it in such a way that you don't actually come to understand the wonder of being able to speak isiXhosa. You know, that whole experience of what that history of the language embodies and so on is such a wonderful, wonderful thing, you know, and you need to be able to grasp that and to be able to make it a gift which your child wants to carry in his or her, their life, you know, for the rest of their lives. But when that language reduces and says to that child, you know, that it is in your blood, it is in your genes, it's in your, you know, body, in the way, that's the master's language. And that's the way in which that language has brought us to this utter sense of inferiority, the sense of inferiority. And we've got to get out of it, you know, and getting out of it is telling our children how valuable their past is.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Crane. I'm going to bring in Eusebius there. And I think I want to just draw back to this idea of pain, right? And I mean, Crane is saying we need to think about different ways in which we talk about history, right? In some way, we are curating a different kind of history. And I am wondering, when we consider things such as Collins, Koza, Amos, Collins, Amos, Usiso Amos, for example, those acts of history happening, how then do we curate a history where we decenter ourselves and our pain, as Crane arguably suggests?
So here's what an anti-racist project would look like practically in a productive and forward-looking going way, Sipokazi. I've worked in media and I've worked in the academy, so those are the two spaces I can speak to the most. Let's take the academy. Part of my suspicion around concepts such as inclusiveness and diversity is that they don't go far enough to challenge institutions and individuals within institutions to think proactively about what the positive project looks like, as opposed to something as thin in democratic theory, such as equality of opportunity. Give Eusebius a chance to be part of the race, but otherwise you don't have to think about his biography and his history and what he brings with him into the faculty, into the class, into the maths Olympiad, into the entrance exam to try and get into the building. And I'll give you a practical example from the university currently known as Rhodes. Many years ago, a friend of mine was hosting as an academic Mandela, who is one of the country's best contemporary novelists and thinkers, in the politics or history department. And they wrote to their colleagues in the English department and said, on our budget, Put Mandela is coming down to Makhanda, Grahamstown back then. Would you like to take the opportunity to, for free, also host him in the English department as one of our best novelists? To which the response was almost verbatim, who? And what that tells you is those people do not regard Black thought to be worthy of being part of an English literature curriculum in this department. You might have the odd department thinking it's woke by teaching The Quiet Violence of Dreams by Sello Dacre, and then it has paid homage to Black South African contemporary writing. But good luck trying to find Zukiswa Warner, Tumla Kola, Nick Mhlongo, and everyone else there, let alone those who are much older, who have been writing absolutely brilliantly, and not only the political literature that it was writing against the apartheid government. The point that I'm making with that, Sipokazi, is if we talk about inclusiveness, then we start doing a phenotypical head count. Okay, we've now got 2 Black staff members. We've now got Boosie in charge of the program. Therefore, all is well with me as the CEO, with my company, with my Department of English Literature or Philosophy. I am teaching Fanon, so I don't need to worry about the fact that my course on feminism only has white feminists and that Black feminist thinking is completely airbrushed. And that for me is what it means to take seriously an anti-racist project. It means looking at the nuts and bolts of how your company is structured, how it operates, explicit and implicit biases. And if you are an academic watching this conversation, how you teach, your teaching praxis, your register, your tonality, your examples, and of course, your curricular content. And those are the kinds of things we need to think about in a really detailed way if we take the anti-racist project seriously.
All right. Busisiwe, just to piggyback on that element, Eusebius mentions about how institutions fail to address these issues. When we're thinking about Black Lives Matter as a movement that addresses institutional racism, but I mean, in South Africa, Fees Must Fall was eloquently and quite articulately doing the very same thing, quite a complex manner, in terms of how do you think about the curriculum. But also one of the intersecting things that came out of, movements such as Fees Must Fall is also coming out of Black Lives Matter is the issue of gender, is the issue of queer bodies. And we're thinking particularly about how the numbers are rising in terms of queer and in some cases heterosexual female bodies dying at the hands of men. Do you see those intersections happening in the reports that you receive? And then there's a question from Kamo asking you, Busisiwe, please tell us, what is your experience been in how you overcame some of the psychological effects, of course, of the cases that you deal with? And then secondly, what pushed you to become an anti-racism activist?
Okay, thank you for the questions. I think before I go into that, I just want to touch on what Prof was saying about how we bring up our children. And that struck me because I have a 5-year-old who has been going through an identity crisis. But I realized I'm the reason behind her own identity crisis. From when she was born, and I go back to school and I take her to be looked after. It's in an Indian home where she now grows up in Lenasia speaking English. She starts talking and the first words are in English. And then all of a sudden, I have stopped speaking Zulu in the house. My mother stopped speaking Zulu because now we're accommodating this child. But at the end of it, it then moved on to the hair, where she thought that her natural hair was not nice. And she wanted long hair because her friend in her classroom has long hair and she's the only African student in that classroom. And I think just speaking to her about why your hair is beautiful and why you are special the way you are has been quite a task for me as a young parent. Buying toys. Until recently, she hated black dolls. And it didn't help that she's fair in complexion, so she calls me black and she's white. And so it's like those little things that we as parents have to adapt with, but also the way we have grown up in the spaces we've been in. We've boxed ourselves and we end up boxing these children so that as they grow up, when she was 2 and she was speaking English, you find this, oh, you speak so well for a 2-year-old, no? And then in your head, you're like, oh, you're saying you speak well for a black child. So those kind of things. But she also grows up thinking that English is the good thing, you know? And anyone who doesn't speak English is less than her. So I think I've had to go through my own processes in changing the ways in which I bring her up. Yeah. So it's quite tough as young parents in post-apartheid South Africa. And then in terms of myself and dealing psychologically or dealing with my own mental health, it hasn't been an easy process. I think the first thing was realizing that I'm not failing in the work that I'm doing, but I'm failing in the way in which I'm personalizing all these stories that I'm getting, you know, all these people's experiences, these people's hurts and their own traumatic things. And I've learned to write more than talk. I'm more of a person who doesn't share their feelings that often. So my escape has been writing, and I don't share my writings, but that has been my escape. But also getting into anti-racism work was by flukes for me. It wasn't something that I chose, but it's more something that chose me. In a sense of, I was a volunteer at the Katrada Foundation, while I was a sports assistant for the Department of Sports and Rec. And from my volunteering, our executive director was like, we want to start a youth department. Would you want to start that off? And that's how I got into the mix of things, you know? So I didn't choose to be an anti-racism or anti-racist activist, but the job chose me, and I quite enjoy it because I feel even if it's one person that I assist in a day, I have done something, and I don't have to be in the limelight, but I work more comfortably from the background. So yeah, I'm not sure if I haven't answered anything.
No, you have. Thank you so much, Busisiwe. Crane, why is race and racism something that Black bodies and people of color are always concerned about or having to deal with, as opposed to white bodies? And there is a question coming from Paulette here. Isn't race a construct inherently racist? Could race have any existence without racism?
So let's start with Sipakazi, with this thing about Black people being so concerned about themselves, but so are white people. I mean, people who are white, if you like, and we've come to, in a sense, make so privileged, so superior. So there's another word, and it's not at the tip of my tongue, but our humanness, in a sense, is defined by whiteness, white people tend to, and I'm talking very generally now because not everybody is like that, are jealous of their whiteness. I mean, they hold on to it in ways which when people say I am white, and they are talking about, in a sense, or they're using it to distinguish themselves just in identity terms. In my experience, there's often a thing like, it's the good thing to be. And so it's not just a Black bodies thing. It's the way in which this discourse of the last 500 years has conditioned our language and the ways in which we come to understand who we are, and virtually all of us. The first thing you do when you see somebody is read them in those kinds of terms. So the look, just looking at somebody, is your means of decoding, is your means of locating, is your means of understanding who somebody is. And that's the way in which this dominant discourse, that's the way in which this hegemony has conditioned us. And we've got to stop it. You can't look at somebody and have any idea who they are. You can't. And you've got to come to that realization that what you are looking at gives you no idea of who the person actually is. And that leads me on to this point that one of the messages that you've got there to talk about raced bodies, and this is Eusebius, where I just kind of make a point to you about biology is actually the dominant thing here that we have to deal with. It's not gone away. It's there in the social sciences and the humanities, and people will have the facility and the privilege of being able to talk about social construction, but out in the street every single day, people are using these ideas in these absolutely, and I'm going to use a social science term now, essentialized ways in which biology actually is what is at play and what is going on inside of people's lives. So that's a really important thing that we need to be coming to terms with, and to be working with. How this biology fiction continues to be such a master narrative, and the way in which that narrative is so deeply entrenched and part of science works, Hollywood works, the music industry works, the symbolic industry, right from Picasso to, if you like, the way in which contemporary Hollywood, I mean, all of this stuff operates on those, on that kind of economy of symbols. And it's really crucial. It's really crucial that we come to understand the depth of all of this, and how we begin to turn it around. And that's a long conversation that I really would encourage all of us to be giving a whole lot more time to Sipokazi. I mean, I can't do it justice, right now. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Crane. Eusebius, I mean, you have been mentioning quite in your earlier submissions about this idea of how, universities fail to deal with issues of institutional racism, but I think broadly injustice, right? And quite recently, of course, we had an incident of a professor from UCT who wrote a journal scientific article that was considered to be quite offensive. And the response, of course, was that, well, people can, of course, respond to this in a scientific way by writing, by having, because a special edition would be created for responses. But it seems as if pain and history is being regulated in and of itself. Please do comment on that. There is also another question, coming from Chanel. Can we really dismantle white supremacy if the power structures of the world, so for example, the UN, are structured in such a way that keep the former colonized countries in perpetual debt? And of course, servitude to the colonizers. Yeah.
Thanks, Sipokazi. I want to acknowledge also some people who are watching and engaging, even though our time is limited. Manalisa Klaas, who says, your exercise at the beginning, racism has harmed me from primary school, Eusebius, where my class teacher told me to go to Robben Island when she was sending me to an isolated area in the class. That is where my activism started. It scarred me and it shaped me as a rebellion in all sorts of ways, and many such stories. Another person, also called Sipokazi, my first experience at primary school was being denied leadership on the basis of being black, and many other such comments. But very quickly on pain being regulated, one of the, again, as Crane says, these questions, I think we've made good progress in an hour, and we still have a little bit more time left. And even so, there's some questions we can frame for further discussion that we can't do justice even in a 90-minute discussion. For example, that exercise I'm referencing, there are particular questions I'd love people to ask, especially white allies. White explicit racists, I don't care for too much because I think they're beyond the pale, pardon the pun. But why is it that a conversation about race gets your blood boiling, for example? Why is this invite, when it landed on your timeline, why did it piss you off? You got to sit with that emotion and ask yourself, why does the mere fact of a conversation about race and racism evoke in me deep passion, especially white South Africans? Why does the idea of white privilege, you can say those two words, white privilege, and you will get a stream of online abuse for even introducing that conversation. Before you even put a stake in the conversation with a substantive view, just saying at 8 o'clock tonight, I'm going to have an Instagram live discussion about white privilege, join me. You will already get thousands of people incredibly upset and all puffed up. And you've got to ask yourself, what is it about that? And I want to be provocative, Sipokazi, and answer that question in part. I think part of it is what Crane was referencing earlier. It is because people enjoy being the children of hegemonic forces. They don't want to be seen to be the beneficiaries of intergenerational sins handed down or the proceeds of the moral sins of their grandparents, right? So I don't think that a young white South African is directly to be blamed for 1948, 1820, or 1652. I think that would be irrational. But I do, as a philosophy student, think that if you are the beneficiary of unjust wealth acquisition, that you have a moral duty to make amends. And people do not want to give up privilege. And that is why they want to regulate pain. They want to tell you the fora where pain can be discussed. They want to tell you the rules of engagement. They want to tell Busi, you can talk about your black woman experiences. Please just don't get too upset. Just make sure that you don't alienate those who are potential allies. So we center whiteness and white people even when we talk about black pain, which is fucked up. Because even in a conversation where, as survivors of racism, we are trying to do deep phenomenological work, the work that Crane rightly wants us to do, even then white people are present in this conversation, even though you can't see them on the screen. We reference them indirectly and psychologically because at a psychosocial level, they are still determining aspects of the ways in which we have the conversation. That is how powerful that 500-year history is. And I think that is something that we have to deal with. And then lastly, just a pointed response to one of your commenters online. We haven't had time to go into this conversation, and I'm sure Busi and Crane will agree with me. You cannot, and I've made this point recently on Amanpour and on other international platforms, you cannot talk about dismantling racism without talking about economic power structures that are inherently racist. You can have the same income as your colleague and still be looked down on. So equal pay does not guarantee that you deal with all the attitudinal aspects of racism, but it is a necessary, even if it's not a sufficient condition for dismantling racism, that we dismantle economic injustices. And one of the problems, both intellectually and in the public space, is that conversations about racism are not sufficiently closely tied to conversations about economic power.
Yeah. All right. We still have some more engagement, so we're just going to continue for a little while. I'm going to bring Busisiwe in here. And I'm going to ask you a question as it pertains, of course, to your earlier statement. Eusebius gave us some language there in terms of like imposter syndrome, right? And there's a question there in terms of, from Tiffany, saying, how about the violences against gendered bodies within these racialized movements? How do we heal and solve this complex issue? What have your experiences been, Busisiwe, as someone who's heading the anti-racism framework at Ahmed Cathedra, particularly when we think about how Black women have been narrated to not necessarily be centered in racial conversations? I think even when you think about how racial conversations are curated in the country, who is at the center of our history, who is celebrated, Black women are often sidelined, or at best gender issues are diluted into what is called, the issues of national liberation. What have your experiences been? And just responding to Tiffany, the violence against gendered bodies within these racialized movements.
So I think So I think being a Black woman in post-apartheid South Africa, but also being in the space where we are talking about being anti-racist, building an anti-racist movement, building an anti-racist South Africa, we kind of forget, I don't know if that's deliberate, to look at women or the queer as individuals, We don't focus on that. We run away from female problems, female racial problems, just like we run away from white privilege, It's something that we kind of like don't look at per se. We will look at racism, but not look at how it affects the female in the female body. How does racism aid to the struggle that you're already fighting as a Black person? So you're Black, you're a woman. So you have two swords that are coming in your direction. And I think within these spaces, and not just the anti-racism spaces, but even when it came to your Fees Must Fall movement, you had quite a bit of females that were in the leadership roles, but were they celebrated as much as their male counterparts or parts were celebrated? Or when it comes to also being a female in success, a Black female that's successful, what is attached to that? It's either people view you being in a position because you're there to window dress your organization or your institution. Your intelligence and your knowledge comes secondary to anything else. So I think we need to look at our own spaces as Black women. that when we talk about racism, we need to also be talking about racism against Black women in South Africa, and how being a Black woman is sometimes a disadvantage compared to a Black man even. So I think these are these conversations that we should have and should not shy away from. So you cannot be talking about racism when you're not talking about women. You cannot be talking about racism when you don't look at the abuse that women are facing, but also that the peer group are facing as well. So we need to bring all these things into the conversation. Racism on its own, well, I mean, racism is not just a topic on its own. That's not attached to anything. But I think I got cut off there. Yeah, so what I was trying to say is we cannot separate these issues. We need to be looking at everything. And when we're saying we are leveling the playing field, we need to be leveling it for real, you know, and leave nothing out in our conversations. As much as talking about white privilege, racism is a scary thought for some, we need to be confronting it, but not just talks. We need to start having talks with action. So when we talk, okay, we all know that we are in an unequal society. How do we make it equal? What are the things that we should do? We can't just be talking and talking and talking without putting things into play, without challenging people that also have a playing power in this. For example, our government. How has the government worked in kind of like dismantling everything that we've inherited from apartheid? So you look at where we live, for example. I'm in Lenasia. It's quite far from town, so it's like a 30-minute drive. But it's the way apartheid has placed people. People are in Soweto. Getting to town is a mission. Getting to Sandton, and that's where the money is a mission. How does government now come into play to ensure that everything that we've inherited from apartheid is changed now, you know? How many years are we into democracy, but we are still dealing with the effects of apartheid? We have just taken over from where the apartheid government left us off, you know, and we need to start making changes that will allow us to dismantle the systematic racism that currently exists. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Busisiwe. I just want to bring in Crane there. You know, Busisiwe is talking about this legacy of apartheid, and I think by extension, of course, colonialism. And earlier on, you were talking about these, you know, how race is oftentimes we need to have these contestations about it being Eusebius was mentioning constructivist versus biological, right? I mean, but when we think about education, when we think about how the university is constructed from Europe, from the European perspective, European philosophers, early on Aristotle making the suggestion, of course, that you know, man is superior because of biological factors. You know, that has gone in to feed some of the narratives as to why women are seen as inferior, and that legacy is still there. Please do comment on that, but I want to link that to a question that's coming. Also, I think you can intersect the two from Ruby Ann. When we think about and consider that education is not neutral, how can the educational experiences be more reflective of both our common and different histories and perspectives?
Okay, so let me, thanks very much. So let me just say that this thing about patriarchy is in some ways even deeper than racist constructions. And it's not simply a European thing. It's in many societies. You know, many cultures have this idea that you know, men represent, if you like, God's mission on earth. You know, women are there to serve that mission. Never mind now the fact that we realize, and again, it's this biology thing, that human beings are just not simply men or women in physical terms. I mean, they are on a spectrum. So there's a really interesting development now in biology, which is coming to show us how our bodies are really such complicated things. And so even describing somebody simply as a man was a woman is not such a straightforward thing anymore, you know. So we're in real difficult educational space here now, because everything around you is encoded, if you like, in these dominant messages. The messaging is there from the minute you open your eyes, you know. Your parents have decided it's either blue or pink, you know, and you're encoded, you know, so the whole thing is coded for you. And here, Ruby Ann, you know, it's about us thinking, and we, Ruby Ann, as people who have this responsibility for teaching and learning. I mean, first of all, say that each of us has always a lot to be learning, but to be helping our children, helping ourselves come to understand that you must take absolutely nothing for granted. Nothing. You know, never take anything on its face value. And you have to be, as difficult as it sounds here now, be treating every single moment of your life as a thinking moment. Every single moment. You know, you never stop thinking. And your responsibility is always to be considered, and it's not an educated person's prerogative or privilege. It's all of us. All of us have that capacity to be able to pause before we act. You know, how do we teach our children just that simple? And let me say, that's educatedness. How do we teach that to our children? You know, how do you get into this very simple, if you like, thing of educating your instincts? So if anything is going to happen to you of any kind, you know, how do you get to the point where you make that a thinking moment? And that's, you know, I mean, it's easy to say it, I know, but it's the hard thing that we as human beings, I'd like to say, that we need to be cultivating. You know, I mean, we need to be accepting that life is hard. You know, and working with it, in a way which doesn't make it a punishment, but makes it an actual moment of joy. You can get joy out of that. You can get joy out of the hardness. You know, the hard things can make life meaningful for you in ways which I don't think, you know, we normally think about it like that. We think of pleasure as escape, but we don't need to be structured in that ways, in those ways in which we deal with each other and with ourselves.
All right, let's bring in Eusebius there. Just two questions. One coming from Nehemiah, and Nehemiah is just reflecting on Robin DiAngelo's book on white fragility and how that was. Or as she theorizes it rather as something that is being weaponized against Blacks. What are some of the thoughts on white fragility as within South Africa? And perhaps maybe comment on Crane is talking about that idea of patriarchy not being something that's exclusive, you know, to Eurocentric societies. You know, patriarchy didn't come on a boat. So perhaps comment on Black male privilege, if you can.
Thanks, Sipokazi. I really love the framework that Crane gives us. This work is emotionally and psychosocially difficult, but it doesn't have to be seen as work that is so difficult that it is going to weigh me down, that there should be a kind of, not perversely so, but there is a kind of joy that comes with the opportunity to go on a journey to improve ourselves. And I really think that's stunning. I'd love to hear more of that, read more of that. And many men who are watching this webinar who do work in men's circle, who do mentoring work with younger boys on themselves, I think that's language that you should appropriate and really use that framework. So thank you, Crane, for putting that on the table. Which brings me to the first point I wanted to make, which is directly linked to that, Sipokazi, that it's so important, as you said, that we talk about justice and not just about dismantling racism and its vestiges. Because the Justice Project is a bigger project than the project of getting rid of anti-Black racism in the world. And the Justice Project must be an intersectional project. And if that language alienates you or it's a bit queer theoretically, we can find simpler language that the average Joe can understand, but the concept is more important than the word. And what I mean by the concept is, again, to tap into what both Busi had said and Crane. If we take Black men as a site of discussion for just 30 seconds, we have a lot of toxicity in us. We are violent, gay Black men included, myself as Eusebius included in that. And we have harmed other men, harm ourselves, and we most definitely harm girls and women and differently gendered persons, because the fact that we have survived racism doesn't automatically mean that we are fluent in how to be gentle and kind in our relations with ourselves, one another, and with women. And I think we need a deep conversation, the kinds of conversations that Kopana Ratele and many of his colleagues have opened up about different kinds of masculinities, working class masculinity, masculinities in Black communities, Black middle class communities, white communities. And it's not to essentialize those terms, but to recognize that we have different biographies. That means that although masculinity has in common violence, the way it plays out in particular ways differs depending on your background. And then lastly, on this question of white fragility, you know, I'm becoming, not just politically, but intellectually quite interested in thinking through and writing about white progressives who really, they're beginning to fascinate me in the same way in which Nikolai Netras is fascinated by why Black people don't care about rats in the townships in Cape Town. White progressives, I think, should be a subject of the anthropological gaze. It's our turn to observe them as left-wing Black commentators. White fragility is a thing, and white progressives in particular often take up discursive space instead of actually listening. And a classic example, and it often gets lampooned, sometimes unfairly, often not, is, for example, how white liberals will weaponize their tears in a conversation where the experiences of Black people as survivors of the history of white supremacy should be centered in dialogue and in conversation. But in order to signal their virtue, a white person can end up gobbling up most of the conversational time by performing their allyship. And in that sense, the fragility of white people, not just white racists, but also white self-styled liberals and progressives, is something that requires far greater analytical description and critique than this conversation allows.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm just looking at time, and I think, colleagues, I'm going to allow you all about 2 minutes for closing comments. Nothing over that. So just about 2 minutes for closing comments. Any parting words you'd like to leave with us? Shall we start with you, Crane?
So I think we mustn't, you see, we can easily let this moment of what has happened in the United States pass us by. I think this is how things happen. So you had a global response to the events of the United States. And I think that we have to find ways of extending that. And this is where I am critical of where we are as social movements around the world. Our social movements have become, if you like, media movements, as opposed to deep, embedded, organized structures in society, which is what used to be the case in the 1980s and the 1990s. Now, of course, I'm nostalgic about that, you know, but there were deep things about how you kind of build movements. And you saw most fatally, actually, with the Occupy movement, that was a really important moment in civil societies and the protest movement's history. But that movement, and the same thing can happen with Black Lives Matter, that movement faltered because it wasn't structured and if you like, embedded in organized ways. And we've got to organize. There's no shortcut here at all. You've got to find ways of being able to hold yourself to account and hold your comrades to account. There's no other way in which to do this. So the shaming thing that happens on social media is one form, but it's not a very healthy form. We've got to be able to hold colleagues to account where they can account for themselves, speak. And so I'm all for building movements. And this is what we actually don't have at the moment. And I'm appealing for if you like, a return to some of the elements of those kinds of ways of managing our ways against dominance. Thanks.
Thank you, Crane. Eusebius?
Hi. So yeah, one can't have a conversation about race without quoting James Baldwin. I mean, that would just be completely unacceptable. And here's one of many quotes that I think I want to end with. I think that the inability to love is the central problem, because that inability masks a certain terror, and that terror is the terror of being touched. And if you can't be touched, you can't be changed. And if you can't be changed, you can't be alive. I want to invite everyone who's watched this webinar, Sipokazi, to embrace discomfort. No pedagogical change, as Crane agitates for rightly, can happen in a space where worldviews are affirmed, echo chambers continue unabated and unengaged. We have got to self-examine and learn to be comfortable with the discomfort of this moment. And if there's one emotion above all else that should guide us, to go back to that quote, it is to center love in our relationships with ourselves, interpersonal dialogue, and also when we examine the institutions that we need to change that are currently unloving in the kinds of spaces that they represent.
Thanks, Eusebius. Busisiwe, your closing comments?
I think first and foremost, I think it would just be appreciating the panel, and I think the way they've allowed me to engage. But also, I think the session on its own just showed me just how much of work one has to do, like myself included. I need to be looking at my own unconscious biasness. I need to be looking at things that are affecting me. And I should be seeing myself from a different light, not as per what is expected of me by society. But also more than ever, now is the time where we build on the anti-racism network here in South Africa. And that's the only way that we can look at effective change, and where people know that wherever they are, there is an institution and an organization that they can go to that will assist them to stand up for themselves, but also to deal with whatever is going on around them. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, colleagues. I think what is coming out quite strongly just from all the panelists with their contributions is this idea of how we just Crane mentioned it earlier, using every moment as a thinking moment, right? And of course, Crane speaking to this idea of us having to take up the agency in how we are going to now navigate the pain that surrounds us, that surrounds these conversations, and the pain that surrounds the history, right? That we find ourselves having to face right now. And that particularly is this history Eusebius speaks about us needing to contest that history, particularly at institutional levels, and how institutions breed these particular cultures that affirm a particular history. And that affirmation happens, of course, at the expense of other bodies continuing to be marginalized in the narratives of what makes institutions, right? And right at the end, of course, Busisiwe, I think also touching on the idea, I think we see it play out in the conversation about how history has somewhat articulated who we are. That phenomenological experience and how we go out into the world has actually been curated for us. And so what do we do with that curation? How do we contest that curation? And of course, important within the work that you do, Busisiwe, is how people need to take action and how action is necessary. So we're very, very grateful for that contribution and for that debate, colleagues. I want to now just give the platform for a few minutes to my colleague Zandile Tose. She is an intern at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy at the Nelson Mandela University. Zandile?
Hi, Sfugazi. All right, thank you so much, Sfugazi. Afternoon, colleagues. Sfugazi Sechilo Zandile Tose. Wow, it's Xhosa City. Loosely translating to time being the enemy. And I do believe that this 90 minutes definitely flew by quickly, especially for an engagement and discussion of this nature, much needed in these critical times. However, I've been given the privilege to extend a vote of thanks on behalf of the Herald and Nelson Mandela Community Dialogue team. Firstly, to our panelists, Professor Crane Sudine, Eusebius McKaiser, and Musum Osi. Thank you so much for the knowledge and scholarship you embody and the kind of thinking that you brought on the table today. I found myself cringing when Eusebius said, let us reflect on how racism has actually harmed us. I mean, intersection to racism, I looked at how homophobia, patriarchy, misogyny, sexism have affected me as a Black woman. So thank you so much for the thinking that you graced us with today. Thank you to everyone who tuned in via live stream. This webinar would have definitely not been possible without your comments, your presence, and your questions that kept the conversation going and actually forced all of us to actually think through to some of the things that we have normalized. Thank you to the organizing team from the Herald side, Theo, no, yes, Berna, Rochelle, Nopila. Thank you from the from the Nelson Mandela University side, Sfugazi, for your beautiful facilitation, mom, and holding the conversation together. Thank you to Sonabo Stirman, Uncle Rodney for organizing everything. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day further.
And just to add on to there, we'd just like to also just extend our gratitude to everyone that was streaming from YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and on the Arena webinar. Thank you so much for your engagements and for always coming and heeding the call to partake in conversations, of course, that matter to us as a nation and as a community. Thank you so much, everyone, and we hope to see you at the next dialogue.